Hello, and thank you for joining today's presentation on Microsoft licensing on AWS. My name is Lance Spratt, and I'm a Senior Manager in Licensing. In my role, I help AWS customers, partners, and internal service teams with Microsoft licensing strategies on AWS. I've been with AWS for 7 years. Prior to joining AWS, I was at Microsoft for 11 years. During my time at Microsoft, I started out in sales, I moved on to licensing and compliance, and finally I managed all the US resellers within the service provider license program. Those roles gave me a lot of knowledge about the cloud, especially how licensing fits into the cloud. I'm going to share that knowledge with you today. Let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to start by talking about AWS License Included, which is the option to purchase instances that include the cost of licensing and the instance cost. Then we'll move to license mobility, which is a Microsoft term for the right to bring certain products covered by software assurance to our shared or dedicated tenant options. Then we'll talk more about dedicated tenant options, followed by an overview of a new option for M365 BYOL on workspaces. Then we'll talk about AWS License Manager, followed by a few points on service provider options. We'll talk about end of support for 2012 server products, modernization, some overviews on best practices, and finally, an introduction to the optimization and licensing assessment, often referred to as OLA for short. Now, if you have any questions, please reach out to us at Microsoft@Amazon.com. My team manages that alias, and we have a very quick response time. That alias can be shared with customers or partners, so anyone can use that alias. It's even used internally here at AWS. So please reach out to us when you need assistance. So why is Microsoft licensing important? The answer to that question is that customers who have a well-informed licensing strategy can really reduce the total cost of ownership. And helping customers understand their license options and how those options impact cost can really help earn trust with customers and help them make the most economical cloud migration possible. So we really focus on licensing so customers understand, again, how to bring licenses and reduce cost while remaining compliant with Microsoft license terms. And we do devote a lot of time and attention to educating our sellers, customers, and partners about these options. This is a very high-level overview of the presentation today. We're going to start talking about license included options, which include products like Windows Server and SQL Server on EC2 or VMware Cloud. We'll talk more about bringing licenses to AWS, either to our shared tenant environments through license mobility and software assurance benefits, or to our dedicated tenant environments for those products that do not have license mobility. Now, some of you may know that Microsoft made some changes to licensing in October 2019. We'll talk about those changes during the dedicated part of the presentation. So let's start by talking about AWS License Included, which, as I mentioned, is the option to use instances that include the cost of licensing in the cost of the instance. There are many advantages to using license included instances. The first advantage is being able to pay as you go. This means paying for the resources that you require when you require those resources, and being able to turn off those resources when they're not required and stop paying for them. One example of a customer who might take advantage of this arrangement would be an online retailer. As the holiday approaches, that online retailer will spin up additional resources. Once that holiday is passed, they'll turn off those resources and save money. Prior to the cloud, that same customer would have to have owned enough hardware and licenses to cover their busiest day of the year. So being able to pay as you go is a great solution for any customers who have dynamic use cases. Online retailer is just one good example. Another advantage is that current and legacy versions of Microsoft software are available. Customers using EC2, as an example, have access to anything that's still supported by Microsoft when it comes to Windows Server and SQL Server. They don't have to run the most current versions, so they do have some choice here. Another advantage of license included instances is that it can help customers reduce or eliminate enterprise agreements. Many of our customers, and certainly our larger customers, transact with Microsoft under enterprise agreements, which have a lot of upfront cost, ongoing payments in the form of software assurance, and restrictive license terms. As customers move to license included, they can lessen the amount of licenses and money they spend on their enterprise agreement, and perhaps even move away from those agreements completely, although I think many customers do maintain enterprise agreements, although they can lessen their reliance on those agreements as they transition to license included. License included instances do not have any software upgrade fees. When a new version of software becomes available, AWS makes that available to our customers right away at no added charge. For example, SQL Server 2022 came out last year, and that was available to our customers right away at no added charge. Another benefit of license included is that AWS is responsible for licensing compliance. This means that customers can focus on their own business and let AWS be responsible for running the data center and being compliant with Microsoft. This is a tremendous burden lifted from the customer. I know from my past experiences what a concern licensing and compliance can be for customers, so this should not be overlooked. And finally, license-included instances are ideal for future modernization plans. Many customers are looking to move away to born-in-the-cloud solutions. Amazon Aurora would be a good example as an alternative to SQL Server. And as customers start to make those transitions, moving away from products like Windows Server or SQL Server, they can do so quite easily when they're using license-included instances. So simply move away from that instance. They don't have any agreements that are locking them in. It's a very easy transition. For infrastructure and database, AWS offers both Windows Server and SQL Server. Windows Server includes 2 administrative remote desktop service connections to administer and manage the environment. If additional remote desktop service licenses are required, customers can purchase those licenses from Microsoft with software assurance and use them on AWS through license mobility benefits. Now, when a customer launches a Windows Server instance, they do not need to select an edition. They will simply select Windows Server on the EC2 console. In contrast, SQL Server does have 3 editions: Standard, Enterprise, and Web. Most customers are familiar with Standard and Enterprise. Enterprise has more functionality, but a much higher cost. Over time, much of the functionality that was only available in Enterprise has moved to Standard, so many customers are surprised and quite happy to learn they can move to Standard and reduce cost. This is one of the key areas that we engage with our customers through our optimization assessments, is helping them identify when Standard could replace Enterprise for reduction in cost. SQL Web Edition is lesser known. SQL Web Edition is used by web hosters. A good example would be GoDaddy here in the US. So SQL Web Edition is used for companies who host websites on behalf of other companies. So it is a very limited use case, but a very low price point. So for web hosters, a great option, but for everybody else, Standard and Enterprise are the recommendations. Now with SQL Server, we offer it both on Amazon EC2 and Amazon Relational Database Services, often referred to as RDS. This is our managed database offering. And watch out for that acronym. You can see that we use it 2 different ways. It could refer to remote desktop services or relational database services. It's always good to clarify that when you're talking to an AWS customer or an AWS salesperson. With regard to pricing models, there are 3. The first is on demand, which went to per second billing as of June 2021. This is the pay-as-you-go option, of course. We also offer reserved instances and savings plans, which allow customers to make commitments for reduced cost. And finally, we offer spot instances, which allow customers to use spare or extra capacity within the AWS environment. Now, if AWS required that capacity, we could repurpose those instances, so they're ideal for non-mission critical workloads, like test dev is a good example. And the great thing about Spot is that customers can save over 80% off of on-demand cost. Now, VMware Cloud also offers license-included Windows Server and SQL Server, but the pricing is provided by VMware. So I'm going to provide some examples of pricing throughout this presentation on EC2, but if you need that pricing from VMware, you'll need to talk to them directly, and my team can always help make that connection. So just let us know if we can help. We also offer cloud desktop and application streaming options. The first one is Amazon Workspaces, which is a Windows 10 experience that runs on Windows Server. So it looks and feels like Windows 10, but again, it runs on Windows Server. Customers do have the option to add Office Professional as license included for an additional charge. AppStream 2.0 is an application streaming service that runs on Windows Server. With regard to pricing models, Workspaces with the Windows 10 experience is billed per hour or per month. Office Professional is billed per user per month on Workspaces. And AppStream 2.0 and Workspaces both offer commercial and academic pricing for Microsoft components. So if you're working with a Microsoft customer or who is academic, or if you are an academic customer and using Workspaces or AppStream, please be sure to bring that to the attention of AWS so we can ensure that you're getting the appropriate discount. EC2 launched License Included Office in November of 2022. The products included are Microsoft Office LTSC Professional Plus 2021. License Included Office on EC2 is delivered through individual remote desktop service sessions, and customers are invoiced per user per month for Microsoft Office and remote desktop services. Now, to be clear, this is a user-based offering, and it does not support robotic process automation, often referred to as RPA or service account use. Again, this is a user-based offering and will certainly meet the user requirements for customers who need to use Office on EC2. EC2 also launched license-included Visual Studio in 2022. They offer both Enterprise and Professional 2022 version. When I'm talking about Visual Studio here, I'm talking about the product itself that's used by developers to design new applications and services. I'm not referring to Visual Studio Subscription, often referred to as MSDN, which is a suite of products, but again, referring to Visual Studio itself. The price is per user per month for Visual Studio. Now let's talk about bringing licenses to AWS, which we often refer to as BYOL, bring your own license. There are many advantages to bringing licenses to AWS. The first advantage is being able to benefit from the efficiencies and security of the cloud while utilizing investments in on-prem software. Many of our customers have significant investments in on-prem software, especially for Windows Server and SQL Server, and the options to bring those licenses to AWS to reduce cost is a very attractive option. I'll show you some examples of that in a few moments. But customers certainly can save money by bringing those licenses, and it helps them avoid paying for something they already own. Bringing licenses to AWS also can extend the lifecycle of prior software versions. Some customers have to run quite old products. We'll use an extreme example, SQL 2000. If a customer is running something quite old, some legacy requirement of SQL 2000, they could bring that product to AWS even though we don't offer it as license included. So it does give customers a lot of choice in that area. Bringing licenses to AWS also helps customers deploy products that are not offered as license included by AWS. There are many examples, SharePoint, Exchange, BizTalk, System Center. Customers can bring and deploy these products on AWS, again, even though we don't offer them as license included. So another question that we often get is which Microsoft agreements permit BYOL? And the answer is most of them do. Here you see some examples, the Enterprise Agreement Subscription, the Server and Cloud Enrollment, MPSA, Open and Open Value. However, BYOL eligibility can depend on product-specific terms, software assurance, and in some scenarios, purchase date. And I'm going to go through those scenarios in just a few moments. I do want to note that the Cloud Solution Provider Program does not permit BYOL on AWS for Windows Server or SQL Server. So keep that in mind. I'll mention that a few times during the presentation. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about different tenant options. A shared tenant environment is referred to by many different names. Multi-tenant, default tenant, public cloud. All these terms refer to the same thing, and that's the fact that multiple customers are sharing the same physical host, all with their own unique workloads running on that host. But again, the physical server itself is shared. In this environment, AWS handles placement, which means we determine which host the instance runs on when a customer spins up an instance, and customers pay per instance at a per second rate for Windows Server and SQL Server. Dedicated instances are single tenant and they're dedicated to one AWS account. When one AWS account is using a dedicated instance, they are the only account on that server at that time. It is dedicated to one account. In this environment, AWS again handles placement, and customers pay per instance with an hourly fee per region. The hourly fee is specific to dedicated instances, and it is $2 per account per hour per region. It does not matter how many instances are running. If a customer running 2 instances or 200 instances in one account in one region, the fee is the same, $2 per hour. Dedicated instances are used primarily for customers bringing products they cannot bring to shared tenant environments due to a lack of license mobility. Two great examples of products that customers might bring to dedicated instances are MSDN, which cover test dev non-production, and VDA, which cover Windows 10 and 11 desktop. Those two products are user-based, and they are not eligible for shared tenant deployment, and it makes a lot of sense for customers to bring those to dedicated instances versus dedicated hosts. Dedicated hosts are similar to dedicated instances. They are dedicated, but in this case, they're dedicated to a customer who can share accounts. A customer is using a dedicated host. They are the only customer using that host, so again, physically dedicated to them. Now, I mentioned the two user-based products on dedicated instances, whereas dedicated hosts are ideal for server products that may not be eligible for license mobility, like Windows Server or SQL Server without software assurance. The great thing about dedicated hosts is that customers do control placement, which is very important for managing the 90-day assignment rule for those products like Windows Server or SQL Server without software assurance. With the ability to manage placement, customers can ensure that when they spin up an instance, they put it on the server they've licensed and keep it there. There are various environments that offer dedicated hosts. EC2 has dedicated hosts, as does Outpost and VMware Cloud, often referred to again as VMC on AWS. Customers using dedicated hosts will pay per host, which is different than the other two options you see here, where customers are paying per instance. The idea on a dedicated host is to license that host and pay for that host and take advantage of the benefits of virtualization with Windows Data Center and SQL Enterprise, for example. These are very common products brought to dedicated hosts to take advantage of those benefits. Now, the reason most customers use dedicated infrastructure is to bring licenses they cannot bring to other environments, but I will say, excuse me, that dedicated instances offer license included Windows Server and SQL Server, and dedicated hosts offer license included Windows Server. Now let's talk about bringing licenses to default tenant environments. License mobility is a Microsoft term for the option to bring certain products with active software assurance to shared or dedicated tenant cloud environments. To qualify for license mobility, the license must have active software assurance. The product must also be eligible for license mobility in the product terms, and not every product is eligible. And the customer must complete a license verification form and send it to Microsoft within 10 days of deployment. I do want to mention AWS is an authorized license mobility partner, which is great news because that's what allows customers to bring those licenses to AWS. Now, if you're not familiar with software assurance is purchased from Microsoft and provides customers a number of benefits, including license mobility, the right to upgrade to new versions upon release, and passive failure benefits for SQL Server. Now, software assurance is mandatory under enterprise agreements for the first 3 years. After those 3 years are up, the customer can either renew software assurance or let it expire and lose the benefits. Under other programs like Open Value, for example, customers have the option to purchase software assurance or choose not to. The best way to find out if a customer has active software assurance is just to ask them. If they're not sure, we can always review a Microsoft license statement, often referred to as MLS for short, but most customers do know whether they have software assurance on their licenses. When customers bring licenses to AWS, they will always bring and install their own software. When they bring the licenses to default tenant environments, they'll start out with an Amazon machine image, and they will install their software on top of that Amazon machine image, which we often refer to as AMI for short. With the release of SQL 2017, the option to bring SQL to Linux became available. So if customers can identify an option to move to Linux instead of Windows Server, that's another great way to reduce cost. Now, there are many products that have license mobility, which again is the option to bring those licenses to shared or dedicated tenant environments. Some products that are included are SQL Server, Remote Desktop Services, Exchange, SharePoint, Dynamics, and System Center. However, there are some products that do not have license mobility, even when they have software assurance. Those products include Windows Server, Windows Desktop, Microsoft Office, and MSDN. AWS would not recommend that customers bring those licenses to our shared tenant environments because that would conflict with Microsoft license terms, unless they have some sort of an exception. The reason we say recommend here, though, is that we do not have visibility into what customers install in our environment. That's private to the customer. So if a customer is about to make a mistake, like installing Office into a shared tenant environment, there's no means in place to warn that customer, which is why we make such an effort through webinars like this to help our customers, sellers, and partners understand how licensing works, how it can help reduce cost, and how customers can maintain compliance with Microsoft while bringing licenses to AWS. SQL is the most common product brought to AWS through license mobility, and when customers bring SQL to our shared tenant environment, they will license by virtual core, often referred to as vCPU for short. We have a website that shows all the virtual core counts for various instance sizes. Here you see a small subset of the R5 family. If a customer were to bring SQL to the R5 24x large, they'd bring 96 cores of SQL. If they were to bring SQL to the R5 large, they'd bring 4 cores of SQL. Now, some of you may know that R5 large only has 2 vCPUs. The reason our website will show 4 is there is a 4-core minimum. So a customer will always have to bring at least 4 cores of SQL Server to cover an instance. Now, I also want to mention that passive failure benefits are enabled for 2014 and later versions. I mentioned this in the prior slide. This means that customers can license the active instance with SQL and software assurance, while they don't have to license SQL on the passive instance. Another great benefit of having software assurance. SQL Server Developer Edition, which is used for dev test non-production, is also eligible for BYOL in shared or dedicated tenant environments. It is a free download, so highly encourage customers to take a look at that and consider that for their dev test non-production needs. SQL Server subscription licenses are also eligible for BYOL, except when they're purchased through CSP. And finally, through license mobility, deployment options include EC2, VMware Cloud, and RDS Custom. Here's an example of passive failover, kind of a visual for you. This is showing a customer using 8 vCPU instances. They're licensing the active instance with SQL plus software assurance, but they don't have to license SQL on that passive instance, as we mentioned before. This is saving the customer 8 cores of SQL, so there's certainly some savings for that customer. They do have to license Windows Server and Compute, of course, but this does allow them to not have to license SQL on passive, which can really help save money. Optimized CPU is a feature that we've developed to give customers some control over the number of licenses they need to bring. Optimized CPU can help customers reduce the number of licenses they need to bring by giving customers some control over their instances. This feature came about due to feedback from customers that wanted a lot of memory, but did not need all the cores to support that memory. So for example, the 32x large instance on the slide now has a lot of memory, but also has a lot of vCPUs at 128. A customer could use optimized CPU first to disable hyperthreading, which would cut those cores in half, and they could further disable cores all the way down to 4. That's a massive change. We'd want to work with customers to help them identify how many cores can be disabled without impacting performance. But the key takeaway here is that customers have some control. They have the ability to lower the number of vCPUs of an instance without impacting memory. I want to emphasize this benefit is only available to help customers reduce BYOL. It has no impact on license included for Windows Server or SQL Server, but certainly can help customers lower the number of licenses for SQL they need to bring. If you'd like to learn more about optimized CPU, there are some great resources on our website, or just reach out to my team for help. A very common question is, how does bringing SQL Server to default tenant EC2 impact cost? So I've got a comparison here of the cost of one R5 X-large instance running 24 hours a day. If a customer running that instance 24 hours a day for a month, the cost for Windows Server and SQL Server Enterprise is $1,413. If that customer were to bring SQL Enterprise with active software assurance, their cost would be $318 a month for Windows Server only. That second example is Windows Server and SQL Server Standard. If a customer were to license both of those through AWS for a month, the cost is $668 a month versus $318 for Windows Server only. So as you can see, customers can save significant money by bringing SQL Server licenses with software assurance. Now, of course, this slide does not contemplate the money the customer pays Microsoft for the license and software assurance, but many customers already own those licenses. It's what we often refer to as a sunk cost, and if customers can save money by bringing those licenses to the cloud, you should certainly evaluate that option. Let's move on to dedicated options for licenses that do not have license mobility. And this is where we need to talk about the changes Microsoft made in 2019. So on October 1st, 2019, Microsoft made changes that impacted BYOL for products without license mobility benefits. To be clear, license mobility was not impacted. So customers that have active software assurance for SQL Server, for example, or under non-CSP subscription are eligible for license mobility, and nothing's changed. So far, everything we've discussed, there have been no changes, but the changes do impact products that don't have license mobility, and that impact is different between perpetual and subscription licenses. A perpetual license is a license a customer owns. They're not renting it, it's theirs to keep. And with regard to perpetual licenses without license mobility, to be eligible for BYOL, there are 3 requirements. The first one is dedicated infrastructure, and that's not new. Dedicated infrastructure has always been required for licenses that don't have license mobility. Number 2, the version must have been available prior to October 1st, 2019. And finally, the license must have been purchased before October 2019, or is a true-up an agreement effective before that date. So the purchase date and version become very important in these scenarios. Common examples of perpetual licenses without license mobility include Windows Server, SQL Server without software assurance, non-O365 Office, and Visual Studio MSDN when purchased under those perpetual agreements. Again, that's the dev test non-production product, MSDN. Now, subscription licenses without license mobility have a few different rules. A subscription license is a license that customers renting from Microsoft. They don't own the license. If they stop paying for the subscription, the rights to use the license go away. So renewals or new subscriptions effective after October 1, 2019 are not eligible for BYOL if the product is not eligible for licensed mobility. Since Microsoft agreements are usually 3 years or less in length, most customers have renewed their agreements since October 1st, 2019 and lost BYOL rights for subscription licenses that don't have licensed mobility. Common examples of subscription licenses without licensed mobility includes Windows Server, M365, O365, subscription MSDN, so that's Visual Studio subscriptions under subscription agreements like Visual Studio subscription, enterprise subscription, or open value subscription. I also want to mention that there is a very new M365 BYOL option on workspaces, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. And again, the caution, Windows Server and SQL Server licenses purchased through CSP are not eligible for BYOL. So as I mentioned, there is a new option for Microsoft 365 BYOL on workspaces. Certain M365 plans include Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise and business BYOL on Amazon workspaces only. So this is very specific to Amazon workspaces and not available in other environments such as EC2. Eligible plans include Microsoft 365 E3, E5, A3, A5, and Business Premium. Apps for enterprise and business include Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, OneDrive, and Teams. And also customers can bring Project and Visual Studio under Project Plan 3/5 and Visual Studio Plan 2. Customers who prefer to bring Windows 10 or 11 will still require VDA, E3, and E5 licenses and dedicated Amazon workspaces. That's important to remember. As we know, M365, E3, and E5 do include the desktop component, but that's not part of this allowance. So if customers want to bring M365 and they want to bring Windows 10 or 11, they certainly can do so, but they need to purchase something called a VDA license. So let's talk more about that. So a very common question is whether Windows Desktop Client is eligible for BYOL. The answer is yes. Customers do require something called a VDA E3 or E5 user subscription, which they buy from Microsoft for Windows Desktop BYOL. Dedicated options on AWS include EC2 dedicated host, dedicated instance, VMC, and dedicated workspaces, which have a 100-seat minimum. Customers who license Windows Desktop through M365 still do require VDA and E3 and E5, but they do get a discounted price. It's about half the cost of a customer who did not have M365. VDA licenses stand alone, so customers don't have to license anything else for desktop. One user licensed with a VDA license could launch up to 4 instances of Windows Desktop in the cloud at one time. And finally, I do want to highlight VDA, E3, and E5 under CSP are eligible for BYOL, so very different than those server products. Windows Server 2022 was released in September of 2021. We do offer that as license included on both EC2 and VMware Cloud, but it's not eligible for BYOL because it was released after October 1st, 2019, and Windows Server is not eligible for license mobility. I do want to mention that AWS License Manager has new functionality that helps customers transition from Windows Server BYOL to license included, which is important. So customers who are currently bringing Windows Server to dedicated hosts, when they decide they want to transition to Windows Server 2022, License Manager can help ease that transition. All right, let's move on to dedicated hosts. The benefits of dedicated hosts are many. I think the primary one is really being able to pay per host. This allows customers to license at the physical level with products like Windows Server and Windows Server Data Center and SQL Server Enterprise and take advantage of those virtualization benefits. Dedicated hosts also allow customers to bring any Microsoft application, regardless of software assurance or license mobility benefits, subject to those October 2019 purchase and version requirements. This is what dedicated host looks like from a configuration perspective. For example, the R5 has 2 sockets, often referred to as processors, and a total of 48 physical cores. If a customer were to bring 48 cores of Windows Data Center and perhaps SQL Enterprise, they could launch 48 large instances, or 24x large, or 12 2x large, and so on. They could even mix those same instance sizes within the same instance type on the same host. Now, software assurance is not required to use a dedicated host, but does enable benefits like passive failover and movement between hosts for SQL Server. So definitely an advantage to having it still. When it comes to the standard products, they're less conducive to virtualization. Windows Server Standard allows a customer 2 instances every time they license the host. So if a customer were to license 48 cores with Windows Standard on a dedicated host, they could launch 2 instances. If they license it a second time, they could launch 4 instances. So the idea is to continually stack licenses on the same host, each time licensing it, enabling 2 more instances. SQL Server Standard, in contrast, is always licensed by vCPU, so very similar as license mobility. In fact, you could even use the same website to get those vCPU counts for different instance sizes. And finally, SQL Server Standard under the Server plus Cal model grants a customer 1 instance per server license. Some customers do still have SQL Server Enterprise Server plus Cal. That license grants them 4 instances with a combined vCPU count of 20. So customers certainly have BWA options for those standard products, but certainly Data Center and SQL Enterprise provide the most benefits for customers. This is a visual that just shows the advantage of bringing SQL Server Enterprise to a dedicated host. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the customer had to license by vCPU and share tenant, which equaled 192 virtual cores. If that customer used dedicated tenancy on the left-hand side, they will only have to license 96 cores, which will give them a total virtual core count of 192. So this is an example of how dedicated hosts can help customers save on licensing. A couple words on dedicated hosts on VMC. Microsoft license terms are similar to EC2 dedicated hosts, as VMC always does run on dedicated physical hosts. So customers using VMC are always using dedicated hosts. VMC includes dedicated hosts that are clustered together, which allows customers to benefit from using BYOL for Windows Server Data Center. Also want to mention that VMware terms do not permit customers to use their own SPLA on VMC for Windows Server or SQL Server Core. I'll talk more about SPLA in just a moment, but that's not an option for BYOL on VMware. Customers cannot bring their own SPLA to VMware or VMC's environment. So a common question around bringing licenses to dedicated hosts is about cost. How much do customers save? So in this example, I've calculated the monthly cost of 12 R5 2x large instances running 24 hours a day for a month. This is very similar to the previous comparison we did around default tenant. This time we're looking at dedicated host though. So let's go through the example. If a customer running 12 R5 2x large instances with Windows Server and SQL Server Enterprise as license included, the cost is almost $34,000 a month. If that customer bought SQL Enterprise with software assurance, their cost for Windows Server only is $7,639 a month. So this is so far very similar to the last comparison we looked at. If that same customer brought Windows Data Center and SQL Enterprise to a dedicated host, their cost drops to $4,857 per month. So as you can see, the dedicated host option is the least expensive. And this will be true for workloads that are steady and predictable. If a customer keeps that host fully utilized for an entire month, they're going to save money. If in contrast, that customer is going to run 12 instances on Mondays, 2 instances on Tuesdays, and turn the server off on the weekend, well, that customer would be far better off using on-demand. But again, for steady, predictable workloads where the customer keeps that host fully utilized, dedicated host will help customers reduce cost. Now, if you haven't looked at dedicated hosts lately, I encourage you to take another look. We've added a lot of new functionality over time. We have multiple instance sizes on the same host, which I mentioned before. There's automated management, auto-scaling, instant placement control, the ability to share hosts across multiple accounts. It can integrate with AWS License Manager, there's instance affinity, automated host recovery, and continuous monitoring with AWS config. So we are constantly innovating on dedicated hosts to make them more and more cloud-like over time. If you haven't looked lately, please take another look. I want to talk about AWS License Manager, which is a free solution that helps customers manage licenses from various vendors, including Microsoft, as well as Oracle, IBM, and SAP. So customers do have many license management challenges. Licensing can be complex. Customers have to think about vendor audits, staying compliant, understanding all those various terms we've been talking about, and controlling overages, or just in other words, not using more licenses than they own. License Manager is a free solution that helps customers manage licenses from different vendors across different environments. It works on-prem, on AWS, even in other clouds. It helps customers stay compliant, and it integrates with AWS services. Here's a screenshot. This is how a customer would first be presented with License Manager. They'll start by defining the rules for their software as they understand them. Different software has different rules. Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, SAP, could be something else. Customers will choose a license counting type based on their understanding. Some products are licensed by vCPU, some by physical core, some by socket, some by instance, and the customer will choose whether or not to enforce a limit. On this slide, you can see where limits are enforced. You can see under one pane of glass, the customer is managing licenses from different vendors, including Oracle, IBM, and Microsoft. So definitely a valuable product. Highly encouraged for any customer bringing licenses to AWS, especially those using dedicated hosts, which can have a little bit more management overhead. All right, so moving on to service provider options. Service providers do have the option to use their own service provider license agreement on AWS. So common scenarios for customers who might be service providers include web hosters, ISVs, and application service providers. Those customers would use a service provider license agreement for those hosted offerings. It allows them to provide software services again to third parties. SPLA is pay-as-you-go with no upfront commitments, and SPLA was not impacted by the October 2019 license changes. One thing I'll mention is that AWS does use a SPLA to license all of our Microsoft license included offerings, including Windows Server and SQL Server on EC2. Now, a common question is whether customers can bring their SPLA licenses to AWS. And the answer is yes. Anything that's user-based would be licensed with a subscriber access license. That would include products like Office, Remote Desktop Services, and Exchange. And customers can deploy them in shared or dedicated tenant environments, like EC2, AppStream, and Workspaces would all be eligible. Any SPLA products that are licensed by physical core or processor would need to be licensed on dedicated hosts. So big difference between user-based and physically based products. Having said that, customers using SPLA on dedicated hosts do get a great cost savings, again, due to the same benefits we talked about before, the ability to license products like Windows Data Center and SQL Enterprise at the physical level. However, Microsoft did make a change last year, and with this change, customers will only be able to use their SPLA agreements on AWS through September 30th, 2025. After that time, those customers should either modernize or move to license included. AWS has been contacting many of the customers using SPLA on AWS, at least those that we know, to make sure this news gets out there. But if you are using SPLA on AWS, please keep this in mind. Everything is fine until September 30th, 2025, but a new option will need to be found after that. Let's talk about end of support for SQL Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. These products have went out of support or are going out of support, depending on when you're viewing this webinar. SQL Server 2012 reached end of support in July 12th of 2022, and Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 will reach end of support in October of 2023. What that means is that Microsoft will no longer offer security updates and patches for those end of support products. Now, customers can still bring products that are end of support, but of course they won't have those security updates and patches. If those customers want to purchase extended security updates for Microsoft, they would be able to get security updates and patches for those products on AWS. If customers are bringing products with active software assurance, they can buy extended security updates for those products. They can also purchase extended security updates for use on license included. Now, extended security updates are rather expensive, and Microsoft has increased the product cost for 2012. So something to keep in mind. If customers have the option to upgrade and the time to upgrade before end of support, they certainly should do so. If customers have active software assurance, they are eligible to upgrade, so that should certainly be considered before purchasing extended security updates. And customers can upgrade to the latest version they had when they had software assurance. So using Windows Server as an example, a customer may not have software assurance today, but if they had software assurance when Windows Server 2019 was released, they could upgrade to that product and be supported. We also offer the end of support migration program for Windows Server, which helps customers migrate applications for unsupported Windows Server versions to supported versions without refactoring. So just let us know if you have questions on that, and on the last slide, I'll give you a link to that program. Now let's talk about modernization. It's important to remind customers that they have a choice. Customers who are concerned about the high cost or complexity of using Microsoft software on AWS should be encouraged to consider transforming their existing applications and infrastructure into higher value cloud native services such as Amazon Aurora that unlock new business capabilities accelerate innovation, and reduce technical debt. These alternatives will help customers evolve their business and leave behind the restrictive license terms and vendor lock-in they face when using Microsoft and other old guard software technologies. Modernization can help IT organizations resolve many of the challenges they face today. Challenges that can be resolved include innovation. Customers can simply innovate faster through modernization. It can help customers reduce license costs. It can help them scale faster. It can help them reduce technical debt. It can improve security and compliance. It can help with skills misalignment. There are some numbers here that are based on some of our analysts, and 91% of enterprises expect cloud usage to exceed their prior plans due to COVID-19, and only 9.1% of global spend is in the cloud today. This represents a tremendous opportunity to help customers move to the cloud and take advantage of all these benefits. Let's move on to best practices. We've talked about a lot of licensing options today, and it can be hard for customers to make a decision. There's license included, there's BYOL, there's shared environments, there's dedicated environments. The good news is that we can help customers make these decisions, and often a mixed licensing model is a win-win for customers. License included is ideal for varying infrastructure, where customers can take advantage of auto-scaling and pay as they go. Whereas BYOL is great for stable and predictable workloads, where customers can reuse licenses and potentially take advantage of the virtualization benefits of licensing Windows Server Data Center and SQL Enterprise at the physical level for virtualization benefits. And it's very important for customers to modernize. So let's move on and talk more about that. We offer something called Compute Optimizer, which provides optimization recommendations based on usage. It applies insights from millions of workloads, and then it makes recommendations, which help customers save time by showing them optimal resources for their workloads. And also, Compute Optimizer keeps working over time to continuously scan resource usage and match workload optimal resources and continue making these recommendations. Other important points around SQL Server and additional considerations. Customers do find a lot of value in evaluating whether they can move to standard in place of SQL Server Enterprise. And SQL Server Standard is much cheaper than SQL Server Enterprise. In fact, it's 74% cheaper. So as customers evaluate and find out that many of the features they need have become available in standard over time, it's a great opportunity to reduce cost and one of the areas we focus on during our optimization and licensing assessments. I also want to say a few words about the Microsoft on AWS cost optimization, which we refer to as MAKO for short. So this provides cost optimization strategies written by industry experts and based on real scenarios. Step 1, the customer will review some recommendations. Step 2, they have the opportunity to speak to an expert. And step 3, they'll go ahead and apply the recommendations and optimize their environment. Please reach out to us if you want more information on this opportunity. Now let's talk about the optimization and licensing assessment, which we often refer to as OLA. The optimization and licensing assessment is a fully funded obligation-free assessment that uses a tool to scan on-prem and cloud workloads. This analysis includes CPU, RAM, storage, and actual resource consumption data. And it helps customers reduce costs through right-sizing their instances and making specific deployment and licensing recommendations. Many customers feel optimized on-prem, but that just means they have enough hardware and licenses to carry their busiest day of the year. As customers move to the cloud and start paying for those resources by the second, it takes on a whole other level of importance that they optimize their workloads, and the optimization assessment can help with that. The average cost savings that OLA represents is usually more than 40% just on licensing and compute. Let's take a look at a couple examples. The first example is a customer looking at a one-year reserved instance cost of $3.5 million. After going through an assessment, we're able to reduce that by 52%, bring it down to $2.1 million. We were looking at VMC for this opportunity, and we were also able to reduce the number of on-prem SQL Server cores they required by 85%. That reduced their software assurance renewal by $3.6 million. So not only was this customer able to reduce the cost of deploying on AWS, they were also able to impact their software assurance renewal and lower that cost at that renewal time. Customer number 2 had a kind of a similar example. This time we're looking at EC2 dedicated hosts. Their one-year reserved instance cost was $18 million. After going through an assessment, we're able to reduce that down to $12 million. Looking at EC2 dedicated hosts and going through right sizing, We're able to reduce Windows Server cores by 85 or 86% and SQL Server cores by 75%, which saved the customers $4.3 million on software assurance. So these are great examples. Important just to keep in mind that customers can reduce the cost of the migration as well as the ongoing payments for software assurance as they right-size these environments. So to wrap up, these are the high points of the presentation today. I'm not going to go back through all these points, but I do want to call out that these are really the 3 points of discussion we typically have. Many customers are familiar with license included cost. They will get that from our calculators, and they usually have a sense of what that may be. They will come to partners or to my team for help reducing that cost, and one of the first things we typically talk about is license mobility. Oftentimes, this is the discussion around whether a customer has software assurance for SQL Server, because as we know, that's a very impactful part of this total cost of ownership discussion. And for those customers that may want to use VMware Cloud or bring Windows Server to EC2 or VMware, of course, dedicated options usually come up. Those dedicated discussions, again, are usually licensing specific, but there can be a lot of cost impact about using dedicated options, especially using those Windows Server Data Center and SQL Server Enterprise in those dedicated environments, which can really help customers reduce cost. So I feel like we always talk about license included and license mobility, and then those dedicated options when the opportunity is right and when it makes sense for the customer. So resources, we have quite a few. If you have any questions and you want to review something from this presentation on our FAQ, please take a look. We do have a public FAQ that covers most everything we've talked about today. If you've got questions, there's that alias again, Microsoft@Amazon.com. If you'd like to learn about license mobility and download the form for verification of licenses with Microsoft, we have a link for that. There's a link to EC2 dedicated hosts, a link to License Manager, some information about our pricing calculator, which is very helpful. I'll just say that our pricing calculator has been updated to help customers make decisions about licensing. We'll ask a series of questions, helping a customer understand which licenses are eligible for BYOL, and of course it provides pricing examples as well. We also have a link to the optimization and licensing assessment, so if you'd like to learn more about that, maybe have an assessment done for your company, or maybe you'd like to provide assessments for our customers, just reach out to us and let us know. There's a link to AWS Cost Optimizer, and finally, a link to the Into Support Migration Program we often refer to as EMP for short.